Documentaries like Patterns of Evidence, which argues for a fringe exodus theory, says repeatedly there is no evidence for an exodus during the time of Ramesses II. Proponents of the 15th century exodus also repeat this line. And so because of this, many suggest the exodus had to happen in a different time period or did not happen at all. I used to think this was the case, until I learned there was evidence for a Semitic population that remained there until the time of Ramesses II. The archaeological evidence not only supports the biblical account of the Exodus, but points to a Ramesside date. To begin, as we noted in a previous video, the account of Joseph most likely aligns with the time of the Hyksos dynasty. The Hyksos capital was at Avaris, which was located in the eastern part of the Nile Delta, which the Bible calls the land of Goshen. During the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period, we know a number of Asiatics moved into the Nile Delta and settled there. Jacob and his family would likely have been one of those groups, and settled in and around Avaris and remained there for generations, like the Pentateuch suggests. Manfred Bietek has led excavations on the site for years, and is the leading expert on ancient Avaris. He notes the region received an irregular, but nonetheless continuous flow of Asiatic immigrants, who contributed distinctly Asiatic elements to life and customs of the local population. But after the Hyksos were defeated and expelled, there is no evidence of a mass exodus of the Asiatic population. There is mounting evidence that a large portion of this population stayed on in Egypt and served their new overlords with their skills and experience, which were in demand in their host country. He notes Canaanite-style artifacts can be found at the site of Avaris during the New Kingdom, as well as a lack of pig bones. So the Semitic people who were there during the Hyksos period seem to have remained and served their new rulers in Egypt's New Kingdom. But the Asiatic population was not treated well. According to the biography of General Amos, son of Abana, when Avaris was taken by the native Egyptians, the inhabitants were treated like captives and enslaved. Typically, Egyptians would not enslave free peoples living within Egypt's borders. But the city of Avaris seems to have been treated as a foreign territory, and foreigners were often enslaved by the Egyptians. This would also account for when the Exodus says a new pharaoh arose who did not know about Joseph. When the native Egyptians took back control of Egypt and kicked out the foreign Hyksos rulers, they worked to wipe away all memory of them. So they would not have cared about a vizier named Joseph from the previous dynasty, especially if they were actively working to erase them from history. In terms of how the Semitic population was treated, it does not appear they were treated well. Bietek notes during the New Kingdom, there is some limited evidence of ritual executions conducted on young males at the site. Also during the New Kingdom, we have evidence slaves were used in the process of brickmaking. A depiction on the tomb of Reichmir shows foreign slaves involved in brickmaking. Later texts during the time of Ramesses II also reference slaves being used in the making of bricks. Additionally, another text reports foreigners, referred to as the Habiru, were dragging stone blocks for the construction of P. Ramesses. So slaves working as brickmakers and helping construct P. Ramesses, as Exodus records, also fits with the archaeological evidence. The evidence strongly indicates Avaris had a Semitic population that was enslaved and involved in making bricks, like what Exodus records. But what follows is Exodus records the Semites that lived there, abandoned the area, and moved to Canaan. So if an Exodus occurred, we should find in the archaeological record that the site was abandoned at some point. The evidence suggests the site of Avaris was abandoned, but not until midway through the reign of Ramesses II. Bietek says there was a West Semitic population living in the Eastern Delta for quite a length of time, from the late 12th dynasty until the Ramesside period. The fortress walls from the time of King Horemheb, found at Esbet Helmi, may be a hint that these walls could be part of this fortress. It cuts into the remains of the Hyksos palace and produced from its filling sherds of Marl D of the late 18th dynasty Ramesside period. From the time afterwards, when everything was in ruins, we have evidence of scattered Ramesside burials and burials of domestic animals, such as dogs, sheep, and goats, which may have been connected with pastoral activity in the region. Major parts of Avaris served as a site for the cemeteries of P. Ramesses during the Ramesside period. The tombs have been largely stripped bare and destroyed by agricultural activity of the last 100 years. After a long hiatus, the site shows traces of a large settlement of the Persian period. In other words, the whole site of Avaris was abandoned during the reign of Ramesses II, and the native population then used the site as a cemetery. The Semitic people who were there abandoned the site and moved elsewhere. Some argued the reason the site was abandoned was because the movement of the Nile changed, which means the river was no longer flowing steady through the area. But this is challenged by the fact that after Avaris was abandoned, the port was still in use, long after the city was abandoned, and was used up until the 20th dynasty. So the site could not have been abandoned due to changes of the Nile, otherwise the port would have been abandoned. Some might attempt to argue this could not be the exodus of the biblical Hebrews, because BTEC also notes we have found evidence that the Canaanite population was worshipping an array of gods at the time of the occupation. But this is not inconsistent with the biblical report. In fact, we should expect to find this, because the book of Joshua explicitly says the Hebrews were worshipping other gods while in Egypt. The Exodus, according to the biblical text, was one of the things God used to bring Israel back to worshipping only Him, which was a process that took several generations to correct. So finding evidence of Canaanite polytheism at Avaris should be expected if the biblical account is accurate. So the fact that Avaris was abandoned during the Ramesside period not only supports the account of the Exodus, but is also strong evidence that the Exodus took place during the Ramesside period. Beyond this, there are a few other minor correlations we can find. Because of the 10th plague, Douglas Petrovich says the Exodus could only have occurred when the pharaoh was not the firstborn and his oldest son did not inherit the throne, because all the firstborn died from the 10th plague. But this is likely a misreading of the text in Exodus, because Exodus 11:12 implies the pharaoh was excluded from the 10th plague, since the plague would start with the firstborn of the pharaoh, not the pharaoh himself. The firstborn was often not the first child born, but the heir designate. Given the context, the 10th plague was likely a reference to the designated heirs of each Egyptian household, who would have been given special treatment from their fathers. This means several pharaohs would have qualified, since it's referring to the heirs, not the biological firstborn child. During the 13th century, Ramesses II's oldest son died suddenly and tragically in the middle of his reign, sometime around 1265 BCE. Due to agricultural leveling, many of the grave sites from that time have been destroyed, so a lot of our archaeological data is missing. But nonetheless, the data does indicate Ramesses II's oldest son did die unexpectedly. If an exodus of Semites did occur around this time and leave a reliable account of their exodus, then we should at least expect to find that at the same time, the pharaoh's heir died, and the evidence does correlate here as well. The plagues were a combination of various natural disasters, most of which would not have left behind any evidence. There are logical explanations for how some of these could have played out. The Nile turning to blood could have been caused by an algae bloom in a Nile estuary, or heightened silt deposits that normally occur during inundation. That could have triggered a chain reaction, causing species like frogs to come out of the river and resulting in the death of the fish and amphibians, bringing things like flies and disease. But much of this would not have left a permanent scar on the land, except for one. In Exodus 10:15, it states the locusts not only ate the crops, but destroyed the trees. Trees are a lot less resilient to that kind of damage, whereas crops can regrow the next year. Now what we find is after this period in Egyptian history, there was a wood shortage. Starting in Dynasty 20, the Egyptians started recycling coffins because there simply was not enough wood to make new ones. We wouldn't expect to find the wood shortage starting during the time of Ramesses II, because the Egyptians could still harvest the existing trunks from the dead trees, the same way loggers will sometimes go in after a forest fire to harvest what wood they can. But new trees would not have fully grown for several years following this event. So over time, a wood shortage would have been felt in Egypt. And correlating with this, we do see a wood shortage in later generations after the 19th dynasty. So, what we have in the archaeological record fits well with the biblical description of what happened in Egypt. We have an Asiatic population in the Nile Delta, which the Bible refers to as the land of Goshen. They were enslaved after a dynasty change and not treated well, and then suddenly abandoned the site during the Ramesside period. We have no reason to think the site was abandoned because the flow of the Nile changed, since the port was still in use. We have a few minor correlations, like the unexpected death of Ramesses II's oldest son, a wood shortage, which could have been caused by the 8th plague, and some indications Egypt lost its hegemonic control, which the Exodus may have contributed to. This alone would not prove an Exodus occurred. However, because we already argued there are internal markers that strengthen the reliability of the Exodus account, the archaeological data can better be explained by arguing the Book of Exodus can account for it. In other words, we have a reliable textual account handed down to us that can account for this circumstantial evidence. If the account of the Exodus did not exist, you could argue there is no reason to explain the abandonment of Avaris with an Exodus event. However, instead of coming up with alternative explanations for the archaeological evidence in Egypt, and a separate reason for why the Book of Exodus was written, we can explain both the internal and external data with one explanation, namely that an exodus from Egypt occurred during the reign of Ramesses II. An historical exodus becomes the simplest explanation.